Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, Dr. Jim Moore, thanks yet again for joining me on Behavioral Observations. This is a very special series that we're starting, and I have had this circled on my calendar since the moment we started talking about this, and I'm really excited to share it with the audience. So what we're doing here, this is be a little bit of a different, kind of an ongoing series, and it really came from a couple of conversations we've had. I know you've been on the show a number of times and are a fan favorite. I think folks really like to hear what you have to say. I know whether I'm talking to you on the podcast or we're just chatting in our various phone calls and whatnot, I always learn something new when I talk with you. And I know by extension, the audience does as well when you've been on the show. So let me just, before we get rolling here into questions, I just want to kind of take just a couple of minutes here to talk about what we have in mind. So as you talked about in the last show, a lot of changes in Jim Moore's world, and one of them being, amongst many other big changes, but one of them being this new job as Chief Clinical Officer for Apollo Behavior. And one of the things we want to do is share some of the cool things that you've been doing there, because I think they have great benefit to the listeners. You know, I'm speaking not to you, of course, because you and I already know this, but speaking directly to the audience here, what Jim and I have in mind is to get together and produce a monthly show that will be in addition to the regular behavioral observations offerings, in which we're going to explore some of the things that you and your colleagues at Apollo are doing that lead to direct improvements in the lives of the clients, and by extension, everyone else around them, their families, the staff that support them, and so on and so forth. It's kind of a big mission, Jim, but I know you're just the guy for the job. So having said that, again, welcome back to Behavioral Observations.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. And I'm really excited because, you know, I believe that discovery happens as much on the clinical level as it does on the academic level. Sometimes when you're a full-time practitioner like I am, you have some great innovations, some great data, but maybe because of the reality of your setting, it's harder to disseminate that in some of our peer-reviewed journals. So I'm really excited to talk to other practitioners and maybe stimulate some thinking on their part that can help improve their practice and the lives that they serve as well.
Yeah, well said. For this inaugural episode, we're going to talk about the problem-solving model that you've shared with me privately. So we're going to get into that. And I've got a whole list of questions related to that. And just as a quick, I guess, note of transparency before we move forward, though, I want to let the audience know that this is indeed sponsored content. So the goal of this is not just to disseminate this information that we feel is helpful, but, you know, just to be perfectly candid, always am with the audience here, is that we want to also kind of highlight the cool stuff at Apollo. And I know it's a relatively new venture, and we want to get people excited about the things happening there. And to the extent to which people are interested in learning more about Apollo, we want to give them ways in which to connect with you guys and learn more. So just wanted to make that bit of a disclosure before we move forward. So having said that, let's just get right into it, Jim. Let's talk about this problem-solving model. It's something that you touched on briefly in your last appearance on the show. You know, we kind of went through like a checklist of things to think about when clients aren't making progress. It was actually kind of an unexpected segment of the show, as often our conversations are. Things come up we don't actually plan to talk about, but end up being some of the most interesting parts of the conversation. So I thought this would be something that would be fun to take a deeper dive into. So we can get into specific elements, but this problem-solving model, I'm curious, maybe as a way to start this off, is certainly we want to know what it is, but I'm also curious about the circumstances under which it's developed. You know, there's probably a lot of cause and effect, or a trial and error learning, I suppose, from a clinician's perspective. And I think that perspective is really helpful for folks to hear about so they can make those observations in their own practice and make improvements as needed?
Well, first of all, I think I was very fortunate. We kind of came up around the same time at that point in history of behavior analysis.
Are you calling me old, Jim?
There wasn't as much. Well, I mean, your certification number is lower than mine, I believe.
Oh, that hurts. That hurts.
I'm not.
It'll be 20. It'll be 20 years.
It's 20 years as a BCBA for me.
Yeah, it'll be 20 years in June.
Oh, mine's 20 years this year as well. But
all right.
Yeah. So I was really in graduate school, and then in my internship and postdoctoral experiences, I was very fortunate to have scientific thinking and Skinner's attitudes of science really ingrained in my thinking. And I think as I came into practice, and as we've kind of seen this explosion of practitioners in our field, what I've noticed is they're not necessarily being exposed to that level of scientific thinking. They're not being told, hey, here are your 3 levels of scientific understanding: description, prediction, control, and how each one of those plays an integral part in problem solving. And so one of the first things, not just here at Apollo, but in my previous practices that I've overseen, is really kind of taking on a mentoring role to say, hey, when things don't go exactly as you may have intended them, or even in your initial assessment process, what are some things to consider as you're kind of doing what I call the behavioral detective work of figuring out appropriate programming and appropriate methodologies for your clients. So really what this is, it's a comprehensive way to help guide especially newer BCBAs through a system of questions and things to consider before just wholesale going in and saying, okay, well, this protocol didn't work. I've used this protocol for other kids, so let's try this one. To really have a good database rationale for why they are making modifications or why they're implementing certain protocols. And to me, it's really rooted in one of those attitudes that Skinner outlined for us of parsimony. Is, okay, let's go through all of the more basic, more simplistic reasons that a client may not be succeeding, and let's rule those out. Because what I've noticed, especially in newer generations, is, and I'm as guilty as anybody if I'm not careful, is my thinking will get too analytical and too complex, and I'll miss something that's very basic. And so what this problem-solving approach is, it's coordinated into an approach we have here, which are clinical rounds. My clinical directors conduct rounds once a week with all the BCBAs. I go into each clinical setting once a month and do what we call grand rounds, which is and before those meetings, the BCBAs actually, we've provided them a worksheet where they work through some basic rule outs, ask themselves some questions, kind of look at the fundamentals of what we expect to have in place before we present learning activities to a client, and kind of problem solve on their own and generate their hypotheses, not just go in and just throw a whole protocol in place, but to say, based on this information and these series of questions that I've asked, such as, simply, has a clear learning environment been established? Does the learner have any potential unearned access to reinforcement that can completely undermine your motivation? What's the overall quality of therapist attention for appropriate client behavior? Just very basic questions that we kind of have the BCBAs go through. And then to sit back and say, okay, here are the contingencies that I meant to have in place. But let me watch the session, and what are the contingencies that the learner is or is not discriminating? Trying to get from the perspective of the learner, not what we intended to have happen, and then hypothesize what may be some solutions to that. And then before just wholesale writing protocols, going into your electronic medical record and changing up your learning trees and all of that, actually going in and probing it out for yourself. It's actually in the Johnson and Pennypacker book, I believe, or it might be the Hayes Nelson or Barlow, Hayes and Nelson text. They call it tinkering with behavior to kind of pilot a new protocol or a modification to a protocol. So it's kind of a comprehensive wholesale way of thinking about problem solving for your clients, both at the initial assessment, but throughout. Every time you go in and conduct a 97155 session, we want our BCBAs going through this problem solving process.
I see. So I don't work in the insurance funded world. But I do recall from my brief time covering a colleague's maternity leave, working in a clinic, if I'm not mistaken, 97155, that's supervision. So for those maybe school-based folks who thankfully don't have to contend with this might be a little bit minutia, but can you just define what 97155 is?
Sure. So it's adaptive protocol treatment with protocol modification is the technical AMA term for it. The American Medical Association does not recognize the term supervision as a billable service, but it is basically in vivo supervision. The BCBA goes into the session while a therapy session is concurrently going on. They observe what is going on and they make any needed changes to protocols that may not be progressing or just not progressing at the rate we would like to see them have. The key factors of that code is that the BCBA must show an interaction with the client and an interaction with the technician. So for all intents and purposes, it is supervision. But just so I hear from my dear friend and longtime mentor, Gina Green, we don't call it that because it's not a recognizable term in the insurance world.
Thank you for that. In my notes of some of our preliminary conversations for this particular episode, one of the things that you had in your problem-solving model here is suggestion for clinicians to rely more on descriptive or narrative data. Now, sometimes when people hear narrative, they're like, oh my gosh, it's not quantitative. It's almost like a swear word or something like that, So I would like you to maybe either disabuse me, I suppose, from that notion, or more generally kind of elaborate on what you mean by that. What type of data would you feel would be helpful under those circumstances? What do you mean by narrative data more specifically? There's probably a number of ways people can kind of interpret that. So
yeah, if we get into the textbook definitions, of course, quantitative, meaning we have numbers behind what we're doing. Qualitative, we don't have numbers, right? So it could be a straight narrative. It could be ABC data, which is very similar to narrative data. What I've noticed over my career is, especially when things are not progressing as you might expect, you go in and one of the first things you have to determine is, have I chosen an appropriate measurement system? Am I measuring this behavior appropriately? I think the next thing that can often happen is, are these contingencies being discriminated as I intend them to be? Now, I'm a big believer in what I call experimental qualitative data, which means I'll go into the session and I will ask the technician to do specific things at specific times. But rather than trying to, in that moment, figure out exactly, maybe I don't have a definition for all of those behaviors at that time, then I'm not going to have the best measurement system. I really just need to know what's going on. I'm like a detective trying to collect clues to put together to build into a quantitative system. And I believe that sometimes narrative or qualitative data gets looked so down upon because maybe folks don't conceptualize its proper role in both assessment and ongoing treatment evaluation. And to me, when I go in and a kid starts a new behavior, am I going to go through this lengthy process of, well, let's sit around in a meeting and talk about how to define that and then how we're going to measure that? No, I want to go in and literally, like a play-by-play announcer, get in writing what is happening, exactly what's happening, with as precise language as I can use. Now, if I have more of a descriptive, meaning I'm not having specific independent variables manipulated, that could have some use, especially as you're trying that first level of scientific understanding, which is description, just trying to get a general sense for the topography of the behavior and maybe some of the antecedent and consequence events around that behavior. But when I really want to see how the behavior is interacting with the environment, I may go in and say, hey, for the next 5 minutes, every time the client does this thing that we've just both seen, I want you to do this. And I'm going to literally write down as much information as I can see. I'm going to take those qualitative data, and I'm going to then try to build the best quantitative system to evaluate and measure that behavior as I can. I think it's, one source of qualitative data that I think eventually we will get even better at is open-ended interviewing. That's descriptive qualitative data right there. But as I'm sure Greg Hanley would say if he were on here, it's very vital to the approach he uses for a reduction of problem behavior. Now, am I going to take a lot of qualitative data and then immediately start implementing programs based off of that? No, I recognize it's at that description and prediction level of understanding. When I start moving into the control where I really want to see behavior change, I'm going to use those qualitative data to build a strong quantitative system of measurement moving forward.
It reminds me of the first interview I did with Merrill Winston. His advice for the newly minted BCBA is that when you're doing an observation is to just write what you see going on. Just write down everything that's happening without analysis. Don't try to say, I think they're doing this for attention, or I think they're escaping to the iPad, or what have you. Leave the analysis out of it. In my mind, that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of us, because we are so attuned, especially if you're coming right out of a program where you've just had all these concepts and principles hammered into you for 2 or 3 or more years. And it's almost like when you're writing, sometimes, people will say, when you're writing, you just write and then you go back and then you edit, which I never, ever do. I'm always like, I'm king backspace, and I have a very hard time shutting off that internal editor. Do you see that when you're coaching practitioners?
Absolutely.
Are there suggestions, or what are the ways in which you help them kind of turn off that analytic part of their repertoire in service of just documenting the who, what, why, when, and where? Or maybe not the why, though. Maybe let's just the who, what, and when.
Well, I think it starts with describing to them, because they may have very well come from a program that either completely trash talked qualitative data or just didn't even talk about it. I actually came upon this notion of experimental quantitative, experimental qualitative, descriptive, quantitative, descriptive, qualitative from a sleep researcher that I had for a research methodology course in graduate school. And what I try to tell them to do is, to the best of your ability, go in and think like you're a court reporter. I have a good friend of mine who's a court reporter, and he says, I really don't attend to the context of what they're saying at all. I just focus on every word that's coming out of their mouth. And that's where the clinical rounds really come into play, where I'm not really interacting with the tech and the client as much as I'm watching the BCBA and coaching them, taking my own notes, and then comparing those afterwards, almost like when you're building initial IOA in behavioral observations, going in and saying, okay, let's now go back and camp up and talk about what we just saw. I'm not really interested in, possibly any of the functional relations that you saw at first. Let's start with really defining the behavior as well as possible, and then a discussion of what is the best measurement methodology to use here. And I find that just with that ongoing in vivo coaching, most of them do a pretty good job. I think another thing that I've noticed, and I picked up on this the last few years, is when we started seeing the growth of these practicum programs where a clinic may partner with a university and the clinic is carrying the load of the practicum supervision, but that student is working as an RBT. What I noticed is a lot of times they're not getting a lot of coaching on how to be a BCBA. They're given all these protocols to run, and they're graduate students, so they're very motivated, so they're likely very successful. Then what starts to happen is they quickly in their mind see a behavior, a topography of behavior, and go, oh, this is the protocol that will fix that, based on their own history as an RBT. And so you kind of have to untangle that and say, listen, this is not a topographical matching game. This is a process. It's a very deductive process where we're going to use as much data, almost like a funnel. It's like the great thing about funnels, it's like if you're changing your oil, it's going to keep all the garbage out of your car, but the oil will get through. So we're going to throw as much data into that as possible, and we're going to really evaluate the quality of it and how much closer does it lead us to solving the problem that that client is experiencing. I just think that it's just ongoing mentoring, which I think is something that really sets us apart. Because a BCBA, for example, I'm here in the Johns Creek Clinic just outside of Atlanta. And this is a fairly large clinic. We have about 45 clients here. Here on site right now, I'm here very often. I'm chief clinical officer. I have a clinical director here, Lindsay Macri, who's outstanding. And we also have our director of clinical operations, Kristen Vaughn, who's a BCBA with over 10 years of experience. Instead of just kind of shoving the BCBA out there in the practice world and say, here you go, we're pulling for you, we are really surrounding them with mentorship, all aligned around the same basic problem-solving approach, so that the language and the feedback they're getting from us is constantly consistent.
Sounds good. One of the things that I want to talk about is there's a couple of bullets that you'd shared with me. And again, we had talked about them in preparation for this. I think that'd be really fun to kind of delve into. We talked about establishing the learning environment. So there's a couple of themes that kind of came out of that discussion. And so there are things like open versus closed economies, assumptions of what is and isn't reinforcing, the functional and topographical components of attending and managing problem behaviors and things like that. So take a moment and go into a little bit more detail in some of these, discussing the open versus closed economy, reinforcement economies. That would be probably a good place to start.
Sure. Let me start by saying, I think the biggest threat, this is today. I might get something different tomorrow based on the rounds that I go on. But I think one of the biggest threats to success is, one, unearned access to reinforcement. And that's often because we don't realize that something the client is accessing is more reinforcing than what we're calling a reinforcer for their acquisition programs. And so I've noticed, and I've consulted with clinics all over the country, and I've noticed that something so basic, I always hear the joke, how many more articles does Java have to publish to show reinforcement works? And I often now respond with as many as it takes for people to stop taking this concept for granted. So they'll go in and maybe they'll really stock their clinic like it's a Toys R Us, back if you remember the old Sears Wish catalog at Christmas that came out.
Now you're really dating us. Come on, man. We'll put a Wikipedia link in the show notes, right?
Yeah, my kids are like, what are you talking about? And you just kind of stock your clinic with all this groovy stuff, but now you've assumed you violated like the cardinal rule of reinforcement. You've assumed something's a reinforcer. And even though the kid may interact with it, they may play with it, do you have any evidence that once you put a work contingency on that stimulus, that it will function as a reinforcer? I go round and round with this because I've used so many different approaches in my career. I think you have to get as much data on the reinforcing efficacy of a stimulus as you can, but you also have to train your technicians to alert you as soon as possible if it seems that a stimulus is not functioning as a reinforcer as you intended. One of the things that we have our technicians do is say, hey, outside during free time, when they just kind of can go whatever, what are the things that they're interacting with? Now, once we've put those stimuli into our acquisition programs, to kind of get into some of Derek Reed's behavioral economics areas, an open economy is very accustomed to a satiation schedule where the stimulus is available at all times, sometimes with a contingency applied to it, oftentimes in a free operant situation. Whereas a closed economy is more of a deprivation schedule, meaning that you're only going to allow that stimulus to be available for these behaviors in these contexts. And so the example I often use is my 22-year-old daughter, when she was younger, was in piano lessons, and her piano teacher, for students who showed up prepared, they would get a little pack of Reese's Pieces. Now, let's forget for a moment that now we're dealing with all these temporally distant consequences. But one major problem was, she goes, it just doesn't seem that Kennedy gives a rip about Reese's Pieces. I'm like, well, no, they're all over my house. Her mother buys them all the time. She can just literally come out of her room and just get a big handful of them out of a bowl. So you have to ask yourself, if a child has free access to a stimulus, X percentage of their day, what will be their motivation to now work for that stimulus for this smaller percent of time when you're working on a particular program? And so one of the things that we try to investigate is not just what are the things they like, what are the things they seem to like to play with, but working with the parents to say, okay, once we've chosen an array of stimuli, how willing are you to not allow access to those stimuli outside of therapy? And of course, you have to have a lot of compassion when you're thinking through this, because like the child's most preferred item may be a stuffed animal that they sleep with. Well, we're not about to now say, well, can't let them sleep with that anymore. Can't let them have that for comfort because we're using that in their manding program right now. So I think that to the best of our ability, we have to limit the amount of open economy that a stimulus lives in if we're going to try to use it as a reinforcer in an acquisition program. I mean, I think one of the things we have to consider is whether it's a behavior reduction program or it's a skill acquisition program, these are new behaviors that you're asking the child to do. You've built a series of contrived contingencies that are unfamiliar to that client. They have other behaviors in their repertoire that have much longer history, so they have more momentum and more mass behind them. So I think that we really have to take a much more serious, intentional, daily, almost moment-to-moment approach to what we're calling reinforcers. Because at the base of everything, if the learner's not attending and the learner's not motivated, it doesn't matter what the rest of your clinical model looks like. They're just not going to succeed. So yeah, we put a lot of thought into constantly talking with parents and open-ended interviewing, observing in the clinics, trying to constantly capture that child's motivation to work. And then put that into chain schedules as we build the learning environment to hopefully eventually make one of the strongest reinforcers for them the attention of the therapist, which is a challenge, as you know, because many of our clients don't present to treatment with an inherent love of adult attention. It's a coordinated approach, but I've found in my career that the sooner I can remove edible and or tangible reinforcement for client behavior and have them functioning primarily on attention for appropriate behavior and then maybe some eventual token economy release to some free time, the more success we're going to have. But if you're sitting there spinning your wheels, one of the first things you should ask yourself is, have I assumed that this thing I'm providing as a consequence is a reinforcer when in fact it's not?
Well, along the same lines of assuming what is and isn't reinforcing, I think you brought this up. You were on Liat and Casey's show recently, and I think you were telling the story about assuming that boisterous social praise and interactions are inherently reinforcing. And that's an assumption. That's perhaps a bit of, behavioral folklore that gets passed down, that every kid wants this, super enthusiastic interaction as a reinforcer.
That's
and
right.
I know you've had to provide some coaching and guidance around that. And there are probably many times when that's exactly what's needed, but not always. So
yeah, it's the same thing as what we were just talking about. You can't assume anything. I see actually great therapists struggle with this as much as maybe not so great therapists, because their attention is so enthusiastic and so great, and it's working for 95% of their clients. But it's that 5%, and they're just not recognizing. And so one of the things we have, I kind of jokingly always say, constantly ask yourself, is the client into me right now? Are they responding to my attention as I want them to? And, it's kind of like my wife calls it that here's my reinforcing face, and behind it, she can see my analytical brain constantly trying to see, like, if my kids or the dog or even she is responding in the way I want them to. When I go in with a new client, I try not to assume anything. And at first, just kind of watch them. And what are they doing? And what are they into? And I don't like using the word pairing as much, because it's now become like this benign term where it's just like, hey, if I'm just right there next to the kid when they're playing with their favorite toy, then magically I'm going to become a conditioned reinforcer for their behavior. And it's just not the case. We really want to find what type of attention initially will that client respond positively to, and continuously evaluate, are they into me? Am I gaining their attention? Are they wanting to interact with me more than things? I think, a lot of what we use is very closely aligned to Bob Schramm's 7 Steps of Instructional Control. And I believe it's in step 6 where he talks, or it might be step 5, where you talk about your classic paradigm. You're sitting there, you do a discrete trial, a kid gets it right. Great job. Here's your iPad. So now you give them the iPad, you turn, you enter your data. So what's happened? Well, they're gaining access to the iPad, but now they're escaping your attention as well. So you may be inadvertently building a negative reinforcement contingency related to your attention. But when it comes to enthusiasm, one of the things that I try to encourage our therapists not to do is engage in what I call ABA RBT robotic voice, which is always, great job, friend. What do you want to do now, friend? And it's like this high pitch that's not normal. So I'm like, listen, when you start with a new client, why not just try being yourself? See how the client responds to that. Try different things. It doesn't always have to be praise. You can describe what they're doing, almost like a play-by-play commentator. You can give appropriate physical touch for appropriate behavior. How do they respond to that? Do they seem to approach that? Do they tend to avoid that? Continuously probe out a variety. And enthusiasm's a big one. There's a lot of kids that's exactly what they need. But I have a kid just right on the other side of the wall here that if I go in and amp up the enthusiasm too much, he's going to start trying to strip naked and get out of the room. He comes from a family where they are very active and very loving, but very low key. So things aren't very loud around his environment. And so one of the things that we also try to do is to say, what types of attention from their parents do they seem to respond positively to? But it's just like everything else. It's a constant evaluation. Is this functioning the way we intend it to? And if not, try something else. We're not locked into this one robotic voice that we have to use when our clients respond correctly or appropriately. To me, the more authentic you can be with a child, the more successful you'll likely be.
All right. So that's certainly something to go on the checklist. And these things all kind of tie into each other, because you would perhaps get that information about that particular client from the laid back household. That might be information you could derive from a parent interview if you ask the right questions, and certainly can be something that you could observe directly if you're in the room just writing down what you see. And
that's right.
Engaging in some of those qualitative aspects of those manipulations of tone and praise statements and things like that. So,
I remember years ago, I had a couple of doc students working for me, and I was supervising them. And I was in a room, we had a camera in the room, and the child was not responding to them. And so I didn't give very precise feedback. I basically went into the room and said, gosh, you guys are boring me to death. I can't imagine what it's like for this kid right now. I said, you got to be more enthusiastic.
That's the Jim Moore straight talk.
Yeah. I was like, good gracious, this is like watching paint dry in here. And so I went back into the camera room to watch, and the next correct response the child did, they both went, great job. And he shot under the table and was cowering under the table. And I was like, well, my feedback led to a huge overcorrection with their level of enthusiasm, where they went from very flat to now way over the top. But we should take that information, and instead of freaking out about it, say, okay, I had that happen to me just a couple of weeks ago. I was in rounds. A young man was having a hard time, and I've worked with him numerous times before, and enthusiasm is something that had worked for him in the past. But for whatever reason, on that day, as soon as I approached him with enthusiasm, he approached me with some aggressive behavior. We do these things I call talk over the room, where we're communicating with our teammates. And I was like, hey, our friend is not feeling enthusiasm today, so I'm about to dial it back and see how he does with some different approaches. And so once I saw that aversive reaction to that enthusiasm, instead of just continuing to try and pound that enthusiasm and say, why aren't you getting it? I'm giving you all this great enthusiasm. I dialed it back, and I was immediately able to get the client back on track. And so it's almost like I constantly have to assess and evaluate whether it's a tangible, whether it's an edible, whether it's social attention. How is the client responding to that potential reinforcer? And it's very important. And we spend a lot of time in our RBT onboarding and throughout the life of an RBT here and training them to be like mini research assistants, for them to constantly evaluate how is the client responding to the things we're assuming are reinforcers.
Let me ask you, I guess this just occurred to me. I get this sometimes when I'm consulting on cases and I come in and I could see the nature of a particular interaction, much in the way you described that little vignette with the student who didn't respond well to that level of enthusiasm. And oftentimes I get the sense that it's easier for me to see those things because I'm not there all the time. And I can see kind of the forest from the trees because I'm not, right up close to it. How do you, this is an admittedly difficult question, but how do you coach up that repertoire of being able to step back like that when you are in the trees every day, if you will, every day? If you're a behavior, and I oftentimes have to tell people because they'll do the Chris Farley, thing. They're like, oh, I'm so stupid. I should have seen that or whatever. And I'm like, no, I'm the guy with the visitor sticker on my shirt. So these things are more apparent to me because I don't live this life every day. And so these things are going to probably be more easily discriminable from my perspective. And I don't think I've really figured out a good way to help those people in the moment to be more observant. I don't know if you've had better luck with that, but what would you say to someone in that situation who's having difficulty kind of cultivating that novel approach, if you will, when it's not novel, it's the opposite of novel?
Yeah, exactly. So, it's kind of like the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt.
Yeah.
Right. The first thing I would say is, hey, welcome to the club. Because the more time you spend with a client, the more you become emotionally attached to them. At least that's what I hope. I mean, I know I'm not going to employ someone here that doesn't care for our kids. But with that emotional connection becomes a reduction of objectivity. Like, I don't spend every day with the same child in this clinic. I see all of them a very distributed amount of time. So I am able to go into sessions and be fairly objective. But as soon as I drive 20 minutes down the road to home, my objectivity is going to go out the window. I mean, I looked at my 18-month-old this morning. I was like, are you kidding me, man? Seriously right now? Are you seriously like throwing your food off your high chair right now? Which is something I would never say to a client. I've thought about this, and I would love to see a panel of some of our best and brightest in the field talk about this, because when I talk to behavior analysts, I'm like, hey, are you as good with your kids as you are your clients? I almost always hear, absolutely not. Absolutely not. They get on my nerves. We do things with our own kids. So with that RBT that's there, developing that relationship, giving them that constant feedback is like, hey, we get that you care. We kind of take a values-based, almost ACT approach with our RBTs. Is that why are you here? Why are you doing this job? We want to transform lives. We want to see our clients gain a higher quality of life. So that means we have to constantly contend and bring that philosophical doubt and skepticism that you always hear me talk about into our own interactions with this client. And to say, hey, maybe I just need to go and sit down with my supervisor and talk about the fact that I'm frustrated right now because my client, spit on me today or strips all day long or whatever these things are, and really talk through those things and try to reset. Our BCBAs have constant team meetings, and we kind of take a team approach where it's not just RBTs isolated out here by themselves with this one client. Everybody's working with everyone, and we're always communicating and talking. And when possible, whether it's an RBT that's in training for graduate school or a BCBA that has free time, we encourage peer review. Hey, you don't work with this kid. Come in, just like you as the consultant in the school, come in and give us some feedback because we may be missing something right now. I think that takes an incredible amount of humility, but that's a specific value we try to build into our practice here to where we're collaborative. We're not a bunch of BCBAs out on islands by ourselves. That to realize, hey, I said to a BCBA in supervision just yesterday, you're getting really frustrated with this kid right now. She goes, yes. I was like, okay, now tell me what will be the benefit of that frustration? It won't benefit anything. I said, it's okay. So let's acknowledge you're frustrated. Let's acknowledge it. But now what do we have to do to reconnect and take committed action back towards these things that we know are more objective and will give us better outcomes? I can't say that that's a perfect approach, but I think that that's a real challenge that doesn't often get discussed. I've never heard a student come out of a graduate program saying, hey, we had a whole class on remaining objective with clients and, reducing some of the bias that can come when you have an emotional attachment. You think about it, it's like my wife said the other day, she goes, why is it that we as humans save our worst behaviors for those people we're closest to? I was like, that's a really good question, because I know I've said things to her and she said things to me that we would not say to some stranger on the road. And that emotional connection, that familiarity can really reduce our objectivity and have us kind of focus more on the aversive MOs that are in place at the time. So we really try to work on that actively. I often have to encourage BCBAs. We provide our BCBAs with explicit leadership training. And one of the things that we've talked about and we've heard from others that have talked about is having those difficult conversations. I saw an RBT this week who's great with two of the kids she works with, not so great with one of the kids she works with. And I just said, when are you going to have that conversation with her? It's like, you've got enough source material from her work with these two clients to say, look at all this outstanding stuff you're doing. Now let's talk about how you're doing with this client. We can't just have our favorite clients and then we want to avoid this. We can't get into that experiential avoidance with our clients. And I think it starts with just an honest conversation, a non-accusatory, open, honest conversation about that. And so the BCBA, as soon as I said, she is, yeah, that doesn't sound like fun. I'm like, no, but it's necessary. It doesn't have to be aversive. You don't have to be a jerk to give that kind of feedback. But I think it's very, very important. It's real. I remember back in the days when I was at the Marcus Institute, now the Marcus Autism Center, you'd be with a highly aggressive or a kid with high rates of SIB, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, the same kid. By Thursday or Friday, yeah, it's getting old. And what do you do to still give that client your best? And what we try to do here is make that an open conversation for all of our folks, rather than you kind of go over here and you suffer in silence. I see so many BCBAs beat themselves up with guilt because they know it. They know when they're not giving their best to a client or when they have a technician not giving their best, they know it. But instead of avoiding that conversation, we just embrace it and say, okay, now what do we do as a team to fix this situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic for sure. I would imagine that learner progress is probably tied to that variability in your desire to go work with that individual. I know some cases that I've been involved with where you feel like you're stuck or you feel like you don't know which clinical direction to go in, or there was a major behavioral event or something like that where someone got hurt or whatever. That can make the colors the nature of serving that individual. It has the potential to, for sure. So I completely get that. And and you wouldn't know unless you start having those conversations. And that might lead to some reflections up the chain as well. It might be the RBTs like, well, your program is not working and I'm getting the crap beat out of me. You go to ABA Reddit. Holy cow. I don't know if you've, for my sins, I've started paying attention to Reddit because you see a lot of real ABA talk out there, and these RBTs, there's a lot of unsupported situations out there that are quite troubling. Of course it's Reddit and Of course it's the internet and it's all those things, but even if a fraction of it's true, a lot of people out there who are struggling with learners who aren't making progress. And that has obviously...
Yeah, I've seen so much tension between BCBAs and the RBTs that they supervise. And it's completely toxic to the clinical environment. And so I would say as much time as I spend on clinical matters, our whole team, starting all the way up to our CEO, we're all lockstep with the most important thing we always have to attend to is the culture within every clinical location. We can't have a dysfunctional relationship between a BCBA and an RBT that they're supervising. Now, we're not going to get in and start doing a bunch of talk therapy. We set our core values, which we actually use in our employee reinforcement system. Positivity was our number one value. And there has to be this bi-directional collaboration. Just because you're the BCBA, the RBT is with the client significantly more time than you are. And instead of this adversarial relationship, try to learn from them. What is they see? And if you train them and equip them with the same processes that we're talking about with scientific problem solving, thinking about behavior analytically and collecting data, you can have how many RBTs you supervise, 6, 7, 8 little mini versions of you. And when you start having those problems, it's not fair if you have on your team one client who's a superstar, just blowing every program out of the water. And these RBTs, just because of how the assignments were made, that's who they get to work with. But then their colleagues get to work with this highly aggressive client, and you're dealing with behavior reduction all the time. So one of the things that we talk about is intermixing deep collaboration and encouraging the BCBAs to actually listen to their RBTs and glean from them and the amount of time they spend with the clients rather than being dismissive, and definitely being present. I love it when I walk through our clinic and any of our locations. I can walk through the clinics, and very rarely do I find a BCBA sequestered behind their desk. They're almost always out in the clinical environment, even if they're not billing. They're out there, they're supporting their teams. We're trying to make a very cohesive and intentional effort to produce the most positive culture and environment we can here.
Awesome. So we talked about, a whole host of things already. One of the things, I suppose, so we talked about the foundational learning environment in terms of open versus closed economy, assumptions with regard to reinforcers. Another thing that I think is on that list is the quality of attention from the learner and the quality of instructions coming from the therapist. Let's talk about that for a little bit. We might get to an appropriate stopping point, and I just want to remind folks that this will be an ongoing discussion, so we don't have to fit it all in this particular conversation.
So when we talk about the foundational learning environment, what I noticed in many of the clinics that I've worked in and consulted with is that how learning was presented to the client was left up to the individual BCBA. And I actually went to a clinic before the pandemic. They had 12 BCBAs in one location. I've never seen so many BCBAs in one location. And they were kind of organized in their building based on their teams. And as I went through the building, what I saw were 12 different approaches to learning. Now, there's not necessarily something inherently wrong with that. But what I've noticed over my career is when we bring in a client on day one, they're not coming from a history of well-managed contingencies associated with appropriate behavior. There's very little stimulus control, and just their history tends to be much more falling on the side of contingencies around problem behavior. What do we do when they're bad? And so years ago, through my working relationship with Megan Miller, I really came across Bob Strand's 7 Steps of Instructional Control. And these were things that I'd been doing just in my own practice for years. And I said, what would happen if a clinic took a coordinated approach toward this, almost like from our positive behavior intervention approach as a tier 1 intervention? All clients are on this protocol. And so years ago, in the practice I was in back in Mississippi, I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're all going to learn this basic instructional control protocol. And this is how all of us will respond to appropriate and inappropriate behaviors on kind of a minor level. Anything that gets up to that severely disruptive level probably needs some more intensive assessment and intervention, but we're going to put everybody on a basic behavior management protocol and see how that impacts behavior. And what I've noticed in the years I've done it, and the same thing when I joined Apollo, is what happens is you knock out about 80 to 85% of your disruptive behavior, because some of that is just boredom, kids being kids, kids having a little bit too much unearned access to reinforcement, not wanting to transition back to tables. And when you put in consistent contingencies and they encounter those contingencies with every therapist that they work with. We embed that into parent training too. So parents are now starting to do these things at home as well. What we start seeing is that for most of our kids, they are much more motivated to work and engage in appropriate behavior. So over the years of collecting data, I found that from those 7 steps, 4 of them seem to be crucial to having an effective learning environment. And that is, how much control does the therapist have over the stimuli in the environment? That's step 1. Does the learner have potential unearned access to reinforcement? Is the environment set up to maximize the therapist's effectiveness? Do they have everything they need? Are they scrambling? Are they trying to get this, the worst case scenario is I get this kid at a table and now I'm fumbling for materials and now I've lost the learner and now I have to try to get them re-engaged. Do I have an effective learning environment so that therapist can just walk in and go?
It's like in a restaurants, like the chefs call it a mise en place. You got everything cut up and ready to go for your service. So that way you can just, everything is here, here, and here, and you can just efficiently cook on the line.
Yeah, that's right. I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but years ago when there was a Michael Keaton movie that came out about the history of McDonald's. I don't know if you saw it. I can't remember. I think it was called The Founder. But anyway, I've always, and I don't want to generalize my preferences on the audience too much, but it's always amazed me that McDonald's is the top fast food in the world. But most people, when you say, hey, don't you really like Burger King's food better? Don't you really like Wendy's food better? Well, yeah, but it's the efficiency. They can get in and out of McDonald's like that. Whereas at Burger King, we went to Burger King a few weeks ago. We waited 35 minutes in the line and they still got our order wrong. You very rarely get your order wrong at McDonald's. It's super fast. And so I think that to have the learning environment set up so that the therapist is empowered to be as efficient as possible is crucial. And you go in and everything's a wreck and you've got too much stuff. Maybe you have your learner here, but right in the corner of the room is like playland. And yeah, you can't get them to attend because they're too busy looking at all these groovy toys that you're not letting them have. So the first is building a learning environment that maximizes effectiveness and efficiency. Then the next step, which is probably the one I spend the most time harping on, is about the interaction with the client, having fun with that client, trying to condition your attention as a powerful reinforcer. Does the environment seem fun and engaging? Then step 3 is getting good stimulus control over instructions. I've noticed in years of collecting data at intake with parents especially, that kids don't discriminate instructions as instructions. So there's no stimulus control, that compliance leads to reinforcement. And so one of the things we tend to do is not deliver instruction in a boring tone, but in a pretty flat tone, help the child discriminate. Hey, this is an instruction. We don't ask. One of my big pet peeves is, hey, if you ask the kid, are you ready to go back to work? You just gave them permission to say, no, I don't want to go back to work. I'm going to sit here and play out here in the motor lab for a little while longer. To be very specific, to be very descriptive, those steps that have been researched on effective instructions, building those and empowering your technicians to give those instructions as effectively as possible. And then do they follow through with those instructions? Is there a consequence for compliance or a lack of compliance? And then finally, step 7, which is what happens when the child engages in problem behavior. We want to build a contrast. It's like I've come to a point in my life where I believe that true extinction is almost impossible to produce in most natural environments. I call it in our clinic extinction-esque. If I build enough contrast, like here's all the reinforcement that's available to you for appropriate behavior, and I'm going to drive its magnitude and its quality as high as I can, then that gives me some grace to perhaps, like if a kid loves physical touch, but they flop and they elope and they strip and they do all these things that could be dangerous or inappropriate in the clinic, well, you're going to have to probably, put your hands on the child at some point. How have you built up appropriate physical touch for appropriate behavior to build that contrast? Because, if you've experienced reinforcement, like if you drink soda out of a straw, And now you get a straw that has a hole in it. You're still getting the reinforcer, but it sure is irritating, isn't it? Mm. So if I can produce enough contrast, I don't have to build pure extinction, but I can make it sure feel like, I call it a desert of nothingness. Make it feel like, it's a desert of nothingness, but don't just sit there and become a statue with them. I had a kid on the floor yesterday, and the therapist was just sitting up in her chair, and every 30 seconds she was going, when you want to have fun, come and sit back and work. And I was like, this isn't an advertisement for fun. Like, why don't you have fun? Kid's just sitting there. He's safe. He's not endangering himself or anyone else, but you still have fun. And as soon as he comes to initiate, now you can build in Premax principle. Oh, you want to play? So I said, hey, let me get in here. I started playing with something I saw him playing with earlier. Next thing I see is little eyes peeking over the table. I said, hey, would you like to play? Yeah. It's like, okay, first sit down and work, and then we'll play. Sat right back in his chair. So immediately, how do I build that contrast? If I allow the child, whatever that reinforcer is it escape? Is it this attention that you're giving, or whatever it is? Are they getting that for inappropriate behavior? And make sure that you've built contrast, that it's very clear to the learner, hey, I get Disney World level reinforcers for appropriate behavior, and I get like 7-Eleven level reinforcers for inappropriate behavior. So those are kind of the first things that when I go into a learning environment to see maybe something isn't progressing as we would like, those are the first 4 things that I look at when I assess the learning environment. And then I get into, does the learner attend, and do they appear to be motivated?
All right. I'm tempted to ask more questions. I think I'd rather do instead is save some of these follow-up questions for subsequent conversations, because I think we could go on for an indefinite amount of time, because these are all really important issues to discuss.
As we talk about clinical cases, you'll see that this is the process we're using. So these are going to be topics that we continuously talk about as we go through more case examples, because that's how we conceptualize our approach to treatment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things we will be doing is talking about specific case studies, because this is going to be the case study series. So we should have some case studies to talk about. And so we'll be talking about some of the learners that have taught you guys a lot, and perhaps looking at some data and things along those lines. So to take this endeavor with you and the rest of the crew at Apollo. For those who want to learn more, and I can put this in the show notes just to make sure, it's apollobehavior.com, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Okay.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
All right. And like I said, I'll have all that information in the show notes. I'd also say too, folks, if there are things that you're responding to, you'd like to hear Jim expand on, feel free to let us know as well. You can use the contact page at behavioralobservations.com. We're both pretty easily findable on social media. You can message either one of us and we'll go from there. But like I said, this is going to be a monthly series. This is something new and different for the podcast, and it's really exciting. So Jim, thanks for taking this step with me.
Oh, it's exciting. And, I would even say, though, people at work might think I'm crazy, feel free to email me if you would like to hear different things, or if you'd like to know more about Apollo, jim.moore@apollobehavior.com. I'd be happy. I can't promise I'll respond in the same day, but I will respond. But I'd love to hear from some of the other practitioners out there. Just because I'm the one here presenting a case study series doesn't mean I have everything figured out. So if practitioners hear me talk about something and say, well, hey, we've tried this approach and we've seen some success, I would love to see a dialogue start up with other practitioners, because I think we have as much to offer to the understanding of human behavior as just about anybody.
Very much so. All right, Jim. Well, we will talk to you next month. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.